smoke and mirrors. The fact is that the Jordanian government has, even in past years, that is the ruling family, has been very adept, and of course with a lot of support from its allies. I mean, Jordan is still, viewed as needed and necessary. I mean, it's strategically positioned. It has a history of both overtly but also covertly in the past working with Israeli governments. It has been an ally of the United States. It's positioned, remember, right next to Iraq, Syria, and look at what's going on. Okay, and so the U.S. has a great interest in wanting to see stability and security there. Okay, on the other hand, what the Jordanians have done is, prior to elections, multiple times, juggled the system in order to determine elections, the outcome of elections. So when the Muslim Brotherhood did well in elections, they then didn't do as well later on. The whole line was, well, they lost favor. If you actually go and take a look at the way voting districts, were redistributed and a lot of other things that went on. Today, Jordan is quietly having tremendous problems with its tribes. The tribes were always loyal to King Hussein. There's a real problem between the current king and these tribes. So it's not just talking about, how do other groups like the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood, respond. There are some serious problems, with that the Jordanian government is facing. They're not all that secure. In addition to the fact that one of the problems they also have is they're stuck right there with the Iraq border, the Syrian border, and not just a question of refugees, but also, the question that, for example, Assad, will make his threatening comments. You've got the issue of Iraq supporting Syria, and so what does that mean in terms of Jordanian security? But I don't see Jordan as out of the woods. I don't see the Jordanian government as significantly secure, at all significantly democratic. In new ways, the king from when he came in, NGOs were replaced by new NGOs, and independent NGOs became replaced by what people called royal NGOs. So there's a lot of stuff going on there that either is not seen or it just is people are distracted from it because that's not going to make the big headline event. Or they don't want people to know. But I'd also say, in general, if you're talking about media coverage, media is very concerned these days with Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and so is the U.S. And then one works quietly with the Jordanians.
Do you see King Abdullah losing power anytime soon?
No, not necessarily, unless he doesn't handle things well. But I think he's got more of a problem now. During the uprisings, he had problems with demonstrations in the streets, etc. But people were clear, including the Muslim Brotherhood, in raising a lot of hard issues, but always not questioning, as it were, broadly speaking, their loyalty to the king. In other words, not talking about overthrowing the king. In fact, one could argue really setting themselves up, as has happened in Morocco, where you wind up, in effect, pushing and demanding a more movement to a constitutional monarchy. But if he winds up having significant problems with the tribes, then there's an issue. And the kind of understanding in the past under his father was, for the tribal leaders, we will be loyal to you and recognize you as king. And Hussein would always go out among the tribes, had real support. But in exchange, we rule in our area. In other words, we tribal leaders, have a lot of, independence. There has been a lot of shifting there. Many of the tribal leaders see the king as moving towards taking power away from them and promoting certain Palestinians, for example, which is kind of ironic because Jordan had brought in Palestinians decades ago when they were driven out after the 1967 war. But then conditions there got really bad, and then you had a period where they really drove out a lot of Palestinians and also suppressed them. But a significant population now in Jordan is Palestinian. The Queen is Palestinian. And so if you're constantly juggling and shifting, if you've got strong tribal support, then that's good versus other sectors. But now if you're having trouble with the tribes and you start now appealing to, moving certain Palestinians into positions of power, well, what you're really trying to do is change the equation. Well, the question is, how significant will a tribal pushback, become? Obviously, the problem we have, to a certain extent, with Afghanistan, as with Iraq, are we going to be leaving the country in better shape or worse shape? Okay, in terms of its infrastructure, et cetera. Now, in different ways. In Iraq, a lot of the infrastructure was destroyed, and nowhere near the amount of reconstruction of that infrastructure occurred. Nowhere near what. So when we leave, and having left in general, there's real problems. Let alone the political instability. Now we can blame the Iraqis, but we have to take part of the blame. And we've been, when you're in a country that long, et cetera, and those kinds of issues go on, and the way in which some of the increase in violence and terrorism occurred, the U.S. also has a role to play there. It's a bit different in Afghanistan because Afghanistan was much more of an undeveloped country. But let's face it, Karzai was our guy. Now, Karzai was a warlord like the rest of them. Only, the judgment was made that Karzai was, a warlord we could deal with. And, of course, Karzai is very smooth. He's got good English. He's very politically adept, as we see. I mean, look at how he survived and how he's able to, on the one hand, have a situation at one time where everybody was saying the Obama administration was sending clear signs that it wasn't happy with Karzai, that could have consequences. But then Karzai could also feel, not only did he survive, but then he could feel free at times, as he has, to really lambast us. Sometimes it was deserved, sometimes it wasn't. It was his way of showing independence. But when you look at U.S. policies, for example, the use of drones, the level of destruction in the military, and particularly the civilian casualties, I mean, that's all on our plate. So, I think the risk we run is that there are people who do appreciate in Afghanistan or in Iraq, depending on who they are and where they live, that we were, from their point of view, keeping the lid on. But when you keep the lid on, it's like a pressure cooker. If you keep the lid on and the pressure's building up, when you walk away, boom, And we're going to be shocked, I think, when you start seeing, after we leave, probably significant numbers in Afghanistan, as in Iraq, who are very negative about America. And your average American's going to look at all the blood we spilled, and all the treasure, that we gave to help them. They're ungrateful. What most Americans really aren't aware of is all the blood that we spilled in the country. I mean, the United States has not, under Bush or this government, really put out the hard numbers on the number of Iraqis who were killed, the numbers who were maimed for life, the numbers who were, et cetera. And yet we know we have the numbers on every American. Well, we don't want to know those other numbers. Because you can get into a whole question of proportionality at a certain point, you see. The same thing would be true in Afghanistan. We're facing that with regard to the use of drones, in some cases. But for the average American who is, let's say, a patriot or a super patriot, they just look and think these people are all ingrates. The average American will think that the United States, which has been involved in the last 80 or 100 years, because they see us as always being the forces of democracy, the fact that we've been involved in so many wars and they will always see us as the good guys who are always involved. And so they don't realize that many countries, including Canadians and others, have long viewed us as a very military and militant country, in our use of force, and all the different wars. I mean, You can talk about and come up with a great scenario for, let's say, our role in World War II. I don't think you can do that with Korea. I don't think you can do that. Certainly you can't do that with Vietnam. And you certainly can't do that with Iraq and Afghanistan. If nothing else, this isn't a black and white issue, but if nothing else, those are such messy wars, and those countries are in such messy situations. And yeah, some of it has to do with their own domestic terrorism, but a fair number of it has to do with the levels of destruction that came from the bombings of the U.S., the actions of U.S. military, which were not always, as it were, defensive, but which could at times be very offensive. And, things like Abu Ghraib and so many other incidents, raise enormous questions. And looking at the use of Guantanamo. How many people have really been convicted of anything? On the other hand, how many people under tremendous pressure have wound up being released and sent back to a Canada or Britain, but who were held for years and tortured? The symbolism of that in terms of America's image, I think it gets lost on a lot of people. I think it's particularly problematic, if you're talking about killing Americans who are in action in a country. So they're fighting with a national movement or domestic movement, okay? To me, that makes perfect sense, okay? They are quite literally enemy combatants. But when you're talking about a situation where there may be an American who's been living in Yemen or whatever, he may be giving speeches, but not committing, violence, and you've been, and the idea that you could decide to kill him anytime over a 9 or 11-month period, not because he's armed and in the streets and fighting, but because he's encouraged people. In other words, if there's no immediacy when you're doing it, that's a real issue. The other issue, though, you see symbolically in terms of how people in the region see things, is we have a regulation that the Obama administration put out in which, males who are between the age of 16 and somewhere in their 40s, okay, can be in certain, and if they're in certain areas, can be presumed to be a threat. And therefore, that would tend to then legitimate or attempt to delegitimate those who would say, hey, wait a minute, you went in and you killed a lot of civilians and a lot of young civilians. And the response would be, wait a minute, they're within that age range of those who, are the age range of militants, regardless of whether or not they're militants. I think that's extraordinarily problematic. And I think the image of somebody sitting in a nice leather chair in South Dakota after breakfast, going and seeing a place and bombing in that way, is going to have a negative effect. There's no doubt about it. And at times we get sucked into it because we do have governments who will denounce us publicly, but privately, may have and has said, okay, come in and use them, but we don't want to be associated with it. Well, but that's exactly what people in their own country believe. So it's not that everybody's naive. And what we are presenting is the notion that we feel free to go any place in the world and intervene in a country and bomb. And yet we would never accept that ourselves. But our response would always be, anybody who did it to us, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. So it's a very, very problematic. I mean, it raises real questions. I think it raises a question about, number one, we have to do away with the phrase, I can't believe we're still using it, war on terrorism. Terrorism is not a person. You can't kill it. Number one, terrorism exists throughout the world. It's ubiquitous. Terrorists can be just a few people. So if you use that as an excuse to go into countries because there are some terrorists in a country where we have a right then to as it were, violate their national boundaries, and then you wind up, having situations where we kill wedding parties, people in wedding parties, where we kill children, and we say, oops, or we say things like, well, this is a hot area, and there were people within that age range that looked suspicious as we're looking from the sky, and that legitimates shooting to kill. It's these are issues that need to be addressed. And, regrettably, I think the Obama administration has addressed some issues staying within our laws and done a better job than the Bush administration. For example, the Bush administration did engage in and get lawyers who would legitimate undermining completely, some of our laws and the Constitution. But the Obama administration's also in other areas attempted to, as we know, increase the level of surveillance in our own country. That the Supreme Court pushed back on that. It's attempted to legitimate the idea that the president can sign off on killing American citizens overseas and not showing some of the documents on drones, even to members of Congress. They're not public documents. Is the level of war we're in now of that magnitude? I don't think so. I mean, sure, we're going to have attacks like the one we just had, and it's terrible, but the magnitude of the attack, 3 people were killed, that's horrendous. It's 3 too many. 170 were injured, but, if you're talking about serious warfare, if you're talking about serious acts of terrorism that have gone on, historically in the late 20th century and now where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases 1 million people have been involved. I mean, we're going to have to live to begin with terrorism. We need to be alert, but we're going to have to live with that. We have, some people say DHS has 335,000 people. That we're not even talking about CIA and everything else. That's absurd. What could 335,000 people do and monitor? How could you justify that financial outlay relative to, as it were, the threat, the magnitude of it? And even when you've got to 335,000 and all the other folks that are operating, look at how we're vulnerable. 2 people, can either fly in or, be living here because it doesn't take much to construct it. They can go on the internet. It doesn't take much money. So we've got to begin to get this into perspective. Otherwise, we're spending enormous amounts of money on intelligence agencies and enormous amounts of money on military. We're starting to cut back, but the plans had been in the late Bush administration for the U.S. to be, and we may be, our military stronger than the next 12 nations. Well, I just don't know what that. I can sometimes be more provocative than I should be, but if this were Attila the Hun wanting to take over the world, is this a defensive posture? And particularly since the American people today don't want to spend the treasure in blood anymore. So you've got a population that doesn't want us to be intervening overseas. So when you then start talking about our military, and how armed we should be in terms of weaponry, for what? Usually we think about it being used outside as opposed to domestic security forces. If we're not going to get involved in too many adventures overseas any longer and, invade and occupy for long periods of time, then we need to reconfigure that. And we need to reconfigure the budget, at home so that we can address the issues of education, the issues of poverty, the issues of, more effectively. I think we have to avoid words like recruiting from Islam, because, for example, we don't, when we talk about a lot of the right-wing groups, as I said earlier, that do have a kind of, Christian base to them, or abortion clinic bombers and stuff, we don't talk about it as if the problem is with Catholicism itself, or with Judaism, you know what I mean? We talk about the extremists, just as people within the mainstream faith see them as aberrant, we talk about it that way. But I think that if you take a look, for example, go back again, if people look at the book, Who Speaks for Islam, we've got hard data there. Despite, despite anti-Americanism in much of the Arab and Muslim world, and in much of the world, there are polls that show, in many parts of the world, we are seen as the problem because of the use of our military. But despite that, and by anti-Americanism here, I don't mean the terrorists who hate America and Americans. I mean people who are anti our foreign policy. So they are people, when we look and say, what do you admire, okay, they quickly identify our economic development, technology, our democracy, And those are things they want, as well as stability and security. Those are all the things that Americans identify for themselves. So we share that in common. But what they identify that Americans don't identify as part of the problem is foreign policy. Americans stop. So Americans will say, what people on the other side will say, we need to know each other better, exchange programs, winning the minds. But they never get around, most Americans, talking about the issue of foreign policy. Because they either don't know it or they just accept the fact that in effect, our foreign policy has somehow been, in one way or another, we've really been good people. We're out there to help the Iraqis. We're out there to, and I think, therefore, that really what you have to do is, for example, if you're talking about domestic terrorism, if you look at major studies, University of North Carolina has done some major studies. The fact is, if you're talking about domestic terrorists, okay, you have a much larger percentage of domestic terrorists and potential domestic terrorists in the non-Muslim population, okay, with these right-wing groups, whatever phrase we want to use for them, okay. When you actually look at Muslim extremists or terrorists, the numbers relative to the population, the numbers that have, for example, actually committed acts of terrorism, okay, are really relatively small. I mean, as with global terrorism, you're talking about a fraction of 1%, okay, of the total whole. So the first thing you have to do is separate out the two, okay? The second thing you have to realize is that, therefore, when you approach that very, very small number, you have to be very precise in how you approach it. If, for example, you say, as Peter King says, Representative Peter King, who since 9/11 and even after these attacks winds up always wanting to talk about and exaggerate the danger of domestic terrorism, and even making his latest statement, which I can't believe he said, which is really stupid, in which he's trying to sound very positive, and says, 95% or 95 or 99%, maybe 95, I forget, 99, of American Muslims are fine. It's the other ones. And that's what justifies, then, our monitoring all the mosques, our, looking at, given this very, very small number, you're going to hold hostage the larger population, in other words, where they are themselves not innocent until proven guilty, but under suspicion. So we're going to do what happened in New York City, where you've got, with no real, not able to measure cause, and there have been studies showing this. The New York City Police Department was monitoring, not only in New York, but even going into New Jersey, and monitoring people and storekeepers for whom they had, or even mosques for whom they had no probable cause. So what one has to do is really work more with the community. We've seen a number of instances where the community, where families have turned in a member of the family, as difficult as that is, or where mosques, have seen people in their mosques. It's a problem. But when you do that, you've got to be able to work and gain confidence. You don't get confidence by going to a mosque and asking all kinds of questions and profiling everybody there and saying, no, we're just doing this in a friendly way. You don't go there and do what has been proven in a number of cases, where you go in and you ask somebody in a mosque to be an informant and to spy, even when you don't have probable cause, and threaten that person that if they don't do it, they will be in prison or they will be deported. There are enough cases of that. We need to handle it in a far more intelligent way. And I think there has been some movement here. Some, but it's not as if you can identify a particular agency. If I look at the FBI, there are parts of the country where the FBI operates, and they know exactly what's going on. They know the nuance. They operate very intelligently. There are other parts of the country where, because of whoever's in the local office, if anything, they cut back on the ability to work in tandem with the community. And the reason why that's important to work with the community is, if they work in tandem with the community, then the broader non-Muslim community will no longer believe that, and you'll have 50, 55% sometimes of Americans saying that they believe that Muslims cannot be trusted, that Islam is a particularly violent religion, and therefore, Muslims are all potential terrorists, or that there should be a double standard when it comes to identity cards, monitoring them, compromising their civil liberties, you see. we can't get beyond that. You know, you had just the other day on Fox, you've had a couple of the Fox people saying horrendous stuff. One of the fellows on Fox talked about the fact that we should just deny their, that's the way the phrase goes, see, not just talking about the Muslim extremists. We should deny their constitutional rights or feel free that we can amend some of those constitutional rights. It doesn't work.